Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be your moderator for today's webinar organized by Funds for NGOs. Today's topic is how to develop an architecture for trusted funders. I am Anutma and I'm here to facilitate this session. First of all, I want to thank each one of you for joining us. This webinar will run for 60 minutes, which includes a 45 minutes of presentation, followed by a 15 minutes of Q&A session. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A option to send in your questions, and we will respond to them during the Q&A session. Let's begin with webinar's objective. The first objective is to understand the dynamics of trust-based giving between NGOs and funders, to work with funders to create shared goals and learn about projects, to manage power differences to ensure funding is equitable, needs-led, to build systems that promote openness and respect in funder relations. Please note that the webinar is being recorded and the recording will be made available in the video section of Funds for NGOs Premium website. And now allow me to introduce today's webinar trainer, Dr. Christopher A. Johnson. Dr. Christopher is an award-winning journalist, editor, publisher, and business management consultant since the 1980s. He is also a former Commonwealth Nuffield Cambridge Press Fellow, Management Science Fellow, a certified Commonwealth Youth Worker, holder of an MBA in Marketing Management, and a doctorate in Business Management. He is renowned for his tutorials in bid writing, business planning, leadership, marketing, and organizational development cum capacity building. He is both founding director of Global Entrepreneurial Development Services Limited and chair of Community Education Academy of Leadership. He supports economic and social policy initiatives in Africa, the Caribbean, the Middle East, and South Asia. Now, I kindly request Dr. Christopher to lead the session and share screen. Doctor, please unmute your mic.
Yes, could you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Yes, so good day, everyone, and welcome to another interesting and I hope informative webinar looking at how to develop an architecture for trusted funders. Most funders, of course, are interested in what NGOs do from time to time. They are fascinated by the work they do. And more importantly, they would like to know how NGOs can collaborate with them in a variety of areas. So this particular presentation will give us a synopsis or at least an illustration of how we need to develop a strategic plan of action or what is called an architecture. It's a sort of a building block or building blocks so that we can develop trust in funding organizations, etc. It's all about confidence building. It's all about opportunities, etc. You heard the learning outcomes. They're about the dynamics of the funders. We're talking here about the commonality of goals, the question of power differences or power dynamics, as we usually describe them, and generally how to develop systems of governance where funders are concerned. So this particular slide looks at how to develop trust between funders and NGOs. And in defining that relationship, we need to look at a number of dimensions, a number of features, a number of characteristics, one of which is transparency. That is about openness. And as we know, openness creates trust. It creates shared access to information and data. And from the NGO's perspective, of course, being honest and straightforward is very, very important indeed. Accountability, this is about how you deal with funds. There is something called fiduciary responsibilities. That's how you manage resources given to you by funders, how you develop proper budgeting and accounting principles, and more importantly, providing regular reports or updates on how the funding is spent and so forth. It also enables funders to understand what is happening because there's a mutual agreement or contract between NGOs and funders themselves. So accountability is premium, it's essential, and it is key towards developing a proper relationship between NGOs and funders. The issue of competence, this is about people being able to deliver a project, manage it efficiently, supervise it, administer it, and at the same time produce results that are comparable to any contract agreement signed between the NGO and the funders. So it is important to have people within the organization who can deliver, whether they are administrators, technicians, whether they are volunteers or counselors or therapists. In the case of health issues, for example, health projects, it is important to have people who can perform, and therefore you need to have evidence-based information and data, key performance indicators, also known as KPIs. And then, of course, we come to the trust issue. People trust you based on your reliability. If you are dependable, if you can be relied on, if you are consistent, people tend to appreciate what you do. And therefore, it is important to always be seen as a reliable and abled partner. And then we talk about mutual respect. Mutual respect simply means respect both ways. The NGO should respect itself, but at the same time, it must respect funders because funders are the ones who provide the resources, financial, technical, advisory, information. And so respecting each other is sine qua non. It's essential in all of this. And then, of course, we spoke about the commonality of interests, which means shared values. That is how you actually develop a rapport or camaraderie between your NGO and funders' relationship. So again, just to repeat, this slide here not only defines the trust relationship between NGOs and funders, but it also provides us a snapshot as to how we should feature in this particular kind of relationship, which should be long-lasting and not on a short-term basis. It is often said that most funding relationships are commercial, some are transactional, some are relational, some are personal. Depending on the kind of funder that you have, if it's a large funder, the relationship would be very, very wide and varied. But in this instance, we are focusing on two types of funding models. One, transactional. This is about having an agreement. It can be a service level agreement. It could be a memorandum of understanding, or it could be simply a contract agreement signed between the two parties. And so a transaction takes place here where the focus is on compliance. So you have your contract, it stipulates very clearly what the conditions are, how the funding will be applied to the particular project, when you should be submitting reports on a regular basis. Is it monthly, quarterly, half yearly? And all of these forms of transactions are very important. And so most of the transactional relationships lie in terms of the administration of that particular project. And so it is the responsibility of trustees and directors of charities and social firms to be on top of their game, to make sure that whatever funding agreement they have, it is delivered to the letter. And there are some percentages given there. 70% of transactional funding is based on certain funding models. It develops a 40 to 50% trust. That could be an issue as well too. If the engagement is not based on trust and confidence, it can erode or it can limit the kind of relationship that the NGO has with the funder. So it is important to understand the kind of transactional relationship that exists. And then you have the communicative approach. This is where you use your personal power. You develop a personalized relationship with the funder. It could be the funding officer directly. It could be the director of funding. It could be a member of the funding body. But whoever you are in contact with, it is important to develop a personal relationship with that individual so that you can build trust and confidence. And that sort of interaction can have a very good impact on the NGO as well as the funders in question. It can help to reduce problem solving. It can help to reduce conflict, in fact, and it could also enhance self-esteem and confidence between and among funders and NGOs. So these two are the basic funding models. As I said, one is transactional, based on a commercial arrangement, and the other is based on a personal arrangement. If we continue on the vein or the line of transparency or openness, it is important that we communicate very clearly what is it we are trying to present. I've said on this platform repeatedly that NGOs must insist that they have the objectives that are clearly defined, simple but intelligible, understandable to the funders. They should try to communicate to the funders when issues are blurred by distinction, when they're not clear, and they should be able to articulate their positions in a way that is concisional and precisional. In relation to transparency, which means openness, which means being fair, you have to be very clear with the funders what is it you're trying to establish. It means that your budget has to be properly estimated. You need to make sure that you have several quotations for various goods and services. You need to make sure that your budgets are clear, so you have your estimated budget. You can also have a fixed budget. You have your value for money indicators under that budget, which shows how the money will be spent and the impact each spending cost will have on the project. And so in terms of transparency and openness, you can build credibility, in other words, build trust, and it will reduce, the perceptions of bias. It will help to build capacity within the organization. And the way you measure it, of course, is through constant feedback. You can do feedback through emails, through informal chats, or through discussion points from time to time. So communication is a two-way process, as I've said. You have the sender, you have the receiver, you have the channel, you have the feedback mechanism as well. Some people depend on text information, but having a dialogue like what we're having on this platform is just as important, because the more you talk to people face to face, the more you can develop a proper working relationship. The more people understand the issues, you could also learn from the individual or individuals, and that can help you to gain satisfaction in the work you do. And finally, it is important to combine both. In other words, communication is about openness, it's about dialogue, discussion. In other words, having a series of conversations with your funder from time to time. And it is good to talk because talking shows that you are a responsible person, and it also shows that you are responsive to changes that are taking place as well. Over the last 20 years, a lot has been written, a lot has been spoken about equality, inclusivity, disadvantage, multiple disadvantage. In fact, in the United States, they're getting rid of EDIs, equality and diversity and inclusion programs at the moment, as you probably know. But in terms of the funding regime, in terms of the relationship you have with your funders, it is important to maintain equity, which is about equality, balance. Men and women should be treated equally, as well as children and young people. And they should be included as well in any funding architecture. And so this is an example of an NGO delivering a program on climate justice or climate action. And they are trying to ensure that you have people with disability conditions as part of this particular project. And you would notice there on your screen in the middle of it, they're referring to the rights and responsibilities of the people with disability. They're talking about giving voice or giving representation to these individuals. They're talking about choice selection or choice variation. And more importantly, they're talking about openness or visibility. And under those particular strands, you would find they're talking about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They're talking about education where people are involved. They're referring to health for all through inclusivity. They're referring to empowering them economically. In other words, they should understand what's happening within the economy, the financial issues that exist among people with disabilities. And then, of course, the humanitarian approach, the human-centered approach, treating people as equals. And then, of course, trying to protect their interests by making sure that their data and everything else is protected. So this is a typical example, if you like, of including people equitably within the funding architecture, making sure that their voices are included, making sure their voices are heard. And so you can do things like case studies, you could do anecdotal evidencing, you can do mini surveys showing the percentage of individuals and numbers who are involved in your funding project. But like I said, this is just a snapshot of what you need to do to impress your funders from time to time. Monitoring and evaluation is key to any project development. And one of the reasons why projects fail from time to time is that the monitoring and evaluation is inflexible. In other words, it's too rigid, or sometimes it doesn't exist at all. On this slide, you would notice there are some very interesting examples of monitoring and evaluation using the flexibility approach. And so we have in terms of features on the left side of your screen, one feature is adaptive monitoring. This is where monitoring is adapted or suited for a particular project. And there's a definition or the reason why we need to have that sort of monitoring, and that is to measure progress. In other words, to track and trace how people are progressing, which type of route they're taking. Are they going into training? Are they interested in further guidance, or do they need more information to make a decision on their future. It goes on to say that funders like this kind of monitoring because you can use dashboards. In other words, you can use data that is on your screen. You can do reviews, you can do video diaries, and also you can allow participants to write down what they think about a particular project. In other words, let them express themselves in their own words. Sometimes they can do diagrammatic representations. Those who have disabilities might do some drawings or illustrations. All of these things reflect feedback. And under monitoring, there's an example where a health funder in Kenya had to relook at their outreach program because they were looking at how to deal with the needs of patients. And so from time to time, when you're doing your monitoring, you have to revise your targets, revise your outcomes based on what is happening on the ground. And that helps you to develop knowledge, and it also helps to inform and guide how data is used for your particular project. In terms of evaluation, it is important to work collaboratively with stakeholders, whether they are in the health service, they're in education, they're in business and industry, they are part of the voluntary sector or civic sector. When you collaborate to evaluate projects, you get better outcomes. And there is one example which suggests that an education foundation decided to work with local NGOs to actually develop evaluation findings together. So they're co-creating, co-producing, and that is to ensure that they have insights and they understand what is happening across the board. So it is good to collaborate. And then, of course, there is flexibility. This is where you allocate resources for one particular item or not. And one example I would give here is that sometimes before the funding is received, you have a change in circumstances on the ground. You may have less participants, you may have less volunteers. And it is important for you to write to the funders explaining to them a change in circumstances, a change in the situation that may arise, so that the funding can be allocated for such changes. And an example is given here where a climate resilience project in the Philippines had to use funding for different priorities because changes were taking place on the ground. Importantly, if you are doing monitoring, it also involves combining several elements of monitoring. In other words, how you integrate certain elements into it. Elements around learning, progression, even developing networks among your participants in order for them to have access to information and data. And again, the example here is a youth program in Ghana decided to bring together several young people. They described them as learning summits. And that is where they actually came together to discuss issues, make representations on their behalf. And also in doing that, they were sharing mutually beneficial objectives. So monitoring and evaluation is important, but it is also important for us to exercise flexibility, being able to adapt to different situations from time to time. Many of the funders in the United Kingdom, in the United States of America, in Europe, and other parts of the world tend to emphasize the importance of co-production, co-designing in grant making. So for example, if you have a heritage project where you're collecting oral histories about a village, a district, a neighborhood, or even a building, a listed building, a building of historical importance. It could be a monument, for example, or it could be a hospital. If you have other individuals involved in helping to write the project, helping to create artifacts, for example, symbols of representation, helping to collect newspaper cuttings or newspaper clippings, helping to collect old magazines and other publications, all of those things represent co-creation. And so when you're putting together a funding program or project, you need to make sure that you have communities that are part of the design of that particular project, because they are the people who will benefit from the project. So you need to have them. And when you do that, you build trust. People have a sense of belonging because they feel that they are part of the project. They have a sense of ownership, and it increases the level of participation by citizens in that particular locality. And by the same token, it could improve the sustenance of that particular project. Funders also tend to look at what is called participation committees. These are people who would sit on the different committees of your organization. So if you are organizing a training program for young people, you might decide to have about 5 or 6 young people sitting on different committees. One might sit on the digital marketing committee using social media to advertise the project. The other might be volunteering to bring people on the project. Another young person might decide to help you with posters, publicity material, training instruction manuals, etc. And another individual might be interested in helping you with evaluating sessions from time to time. So there are different ways in which we can involve participants and others within the co-creation of projects. And then you have proposals where you actually work with funders. So for example, in the United Kingdom and Europe, when funders, for example, issue a tender is a piece of work that you have to deliver for a year, 2 years, 3 years. They tend to look for collaboration. And so they might ask, could you collaborate in terms of information, advice, and guidance? Are you interested in collaborating in a piece of research and development project? How are you working with universities and colleges? Are you working with health services? Are you working with luncheon clubs or elderly clubs or sporting networks? All of these questions are asked to find out whether or not you're working in partnership or you're collaborating with individuals. So it is very important to collaborate with other people, work with other people, work with like-minded charities or charities who are doing things similar to you, because it strengthens the partnership and it develops a mutual understanding of the issues that exist. And it also reduces some of the tension that NGOs have between their members and the society in which they find themselves. Again, we come back to transparency. It is good to have open dialogue and discussion. Some of the calls might be structured. So for example, this presentation that we have today, being done on behalf of Funds for NGOs, is structured. And the reason why it is structured, because we are trying to relay information and data to you so that you can understand how the funding architecture is demonstrated. And then we come back again to evaluation and feedback. If we use the example of the young people who are involved in training and development, we will notice that it is important to have them as part of the evaluation process, because not only are they giving feedback, but they are also helping us to assess and determine the impact of elements of the project on their young people as well. And there's some very notable examples on the screen that you can read regarding co-creation and participatory grant making. As always, it is a challenge to manage funders' expectations. There are lots of questions that we ask ourselves when we're dealing with funders. What is it they're looking for? How much funding are they willing to allocate? What is the purpose of the funding? What are the priorities regarding the funding? How long would that funding last? And what are we expected to do as NGOs? And there's so many questions that you can ask yourself as an NGO organization. But you can only answer those questions, or at least some of them, if you understand what funders are expecting of you or from you. And that is where the challenge lies with NGOs, not just about, having access to funding, but what the funders require. What are their requirements? What are their necessities? What are their needs? And more importantly, what they perceive, what they expect from us. And so on this slide here, we have two aspects of expectations. We have one dealing with coordinated activity. The other is dealing with coordinated funding. And coordinated means working together, being collaborative, partnership, holistic, integral, combined, encompassing, fusing, pulling together different types of resources from different sectors of the country. And so in terms of co-learning, we're talking here about establishing networks, establishing peer groups. So you have people who have interest in apprenticeships. You've got those who are interested in business and industry. You've got those who are interested in research and development, those who are interested in elderly care, others that are interested in accounting and financial procedures. So it is important to have a series of networks within which you can learn from each other, because learning is never complete. Even when a project is completed, you're still learning about the experiences that you may have had on that particular project. The question of how you organize activities is also important. How do you convene shared meetings? How do you develop teams that you need to build on? How do you develop volunteering capacity for volunteers who need that support? What type of information needs exist within and without the organization? And so catering for those needs and ensuring that your project is suitable or tailored or customized for those needs is equally important. And of course, what type of support are you going to give on a long-term basis? So strategic support is about support for the next 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 30 years down the line. And of course, that support must be in keeping or be in line with what funders are expecting, because most funders work on a long-term basis. They're not short-termist. They have annual plans that they have on a equal basis. And then, of course, strategic regranting. This is where funders decide to fund another project from time to time. And so there's this challenge. Hello? Could you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, all right. I was just checking.
Yeah.
Yes, strategic regranting simply means where a funder decides to fund the organization again and again. So, for example, EU funding or European Union funding tends to fund projects repeatedly based on their performance, based on their deliverables, and more importantly, based on their impact assessments or the evaluation reports. one of the charities that I run, for example, have been funded multiple times by the European Social Fund, particularly projects for women, projects for young people, and projects for people with disabilities, as well as small businesses. So when an organization is re-granted or given funding again, it means that you have to ensure that you have a campaign to match fund. So for example, if the funder is offering £50,000, you have to make sure that you have at least some of that money to put into place in order to access that kind of funding. Or it could be the other way around. Your project might cost £50,000 or dollars or shillings, and you have to find 50% of that. So you go to the funder for 50% of that, and then you show by match funding how you would acquire or obtain the remainder. And then you have pooled funding. This is where different funders pool funding. So for example, you go to one organization for 20K, you go to another organization for 10K, and another organization for 10K, so that you can amalgamate or accumulate that amount to 50,000 that you may have decided to estimate. So it is important to understand the expectations of funders, and equally, it is important for you to understand the kind of organization that you're leading in relation to projects. This is a very important slide because every NGO is using digital tools. Every NGO is involved in data collection. You have private data, public data, you've got big data, small data, micro data. All of these data that we collect, we have to make sure that we do not violate the sanctity of people. We do not undermine people's character. We have to ensure that we protect and safeguard people's interests in the process. And so there are a variety of digital tools that we can use to ensure that we protect people's safety, etc. And on your screen on the left-hand side, there's a typical example of using at least 3 types of digital platforms or 3 types of digital tools to safeguard and protect people's interest. If we look at them, each of them one by one, social media. Again, social media, as you know, is not properly regulated, and so people can have a field day on that. It is important to understand how to communicate on social media. If you're using photographs, make sure that you have the consent of people or the permission. Make sure that their privacy, their confidentiality is protected. So for example, if they want to remain anonymous, in other words, they don't want their photographs or their pictures there, please respect their wishes, because social media can easily be used for different purposes. The smartphone, again, you have to make sure that the tools in the smartphone or the features do not in any way create undue damage to individuals. In other words, make sure that the information there is accurate, make sure it is corroborative, and make sure that that information does not in any way suggest anything untoward to those individuals. And then wearable devices. So people, for example, who have issues with disability, people who have arthritic condition, people who have other conditions tend to wear health watches and other digital tools to monitor. So for example, people who have high blood pressure, hypertension, tend to wear these devices to help monitor their blood pressure. And people who also have high blood sugar also tend to wear these devices. So it's important, again, to understand the attitude towards maintaining these digital tools and how important they are. But like I've always said to people, if you don't understand the purpose of digital tools, don't use them. Don't use them at all, because if you don't know how to use them, you'll misuse them. And then you can have a problem in terms of the people who are benefiting from them. And then, of course, you have your data ethics. This is how you conduct yourself in terms of the use of data, how it is collected. These are some of the principles of assessment, determining the data, where the data comes from. You have to make sure that Data Protection Act is preserved. Rules and regulations of information dissemination are adhered to, and all the safeguards need to be in place in order to preserve and protect people's data, because everybody's data is sacred or sacrosanct, and it must be respected. And finally, we come up with a strategy for dealing with funders. We talk about difficult conversations. Difficult conversations mean conversations that relate to the project, the way the project is conceptualized, how it is prepared, how it is designed, and the planning and coordination that go into it, how the issue is discussed, the tone of the issue, how it is framed, and then how it is presented, of course, to the funders. All of these elements are very important. And then, of course, how open we are to information about a particular project. We are writing a project, for example, about heritage preservation. You need to know something about that particular site that you're seeking to preserve, or that particular building. You know, which architect or architects have been involved in the building, who constructed the building, what type of wood or material that was used, what type of painting that was used, what type of design was used in the process. All of these things are very important. So you have to be very open-minded to these issues of risk. And then, of course, problem solving. Problem solving is a very important conversation that we should have with funders. You might have an issue within your community, and so you're using a project to solve it. You're using the funding mechanism, for example, to reduce obesity, to reduce child labor, to reduce women's exclusion from the job market, and so forth, to reduce carbon emissions. All of those are solutions that you are looking for. So whatever you are attempting to resolve, whatever problems you're trying to resolve, always make sure that you have a solution. And more importantly, follow up. Always have a discussion again and again with funders. Try to find out what is it they're trying to accomplish. Have meetings with them, send emails, and then have team meetings or Zoom meetings with them as well. And so today, ladies and gentlemen, we looked at a funding architecture for NGOs and the relationship between NGOs and funders. We looked at a number of issues, relationship models, communication. We looked at monitoring and evaluation and their flexibility approach. We look at co-production and participatory grant making. We also looked at digital tools, and then finally we looked at a strategy for certain types of conversations, looking at projects from concept stage to actual implementation stage. I do hope that this presentation has been of interest to you, as well as informative. I thank you very much for listening, and at this time I'd like to avail myself for any questions that you may wish to ask. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor, for insightful presentation. Participants, now we are taking questions.
You're
The
most welcome.
first question is what indicators most effectively measure trust between funders and partners beyond satisfaction scores?
Yes, it's a very good question. There are several indicators that you can employ or deploy. One of them, of course, is making sure that the documents you have are transparent. In other words, any piece of documentation or any item of information you present to funders are based on reliable information and data, data that is corroborative, data that is verifiable. In other words, it can stand up to public scrutiny, and generally making sure that whatever project you propose is well budgeted for and estimated for. It doesn't matter how many satisfaction scores or surveys you undertake. At the end of the day, you'll be judged by the work that you do at the end of the day. I hope I answered that question fairly clearly. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, for your input. The
Mhm.
next question is how can funders maintain transparency and empathy when addressing failures or project setbacks?
Yes, funders are usually empathetic, maybe not by nature, but by the systems in which they operate. There are certain procedures that they have to operate within and by. So, for example, if your application is rejected, the funder's responsibility is to send an email notifying the grantee or the applicant reasons why the proposal was not successful, and sometimes they set it out in, in bullet points, or sometimes they set it out in explanatory form. It is up to the NGO in question to either decide to have a discussion with that funder, or sometimes NGOs ignore it because they feel, oh, I'm rejected, so there's nothing I can do about it. But a rejection doesn't mean that the project itself has been rejected. All it means is that there are certain elements of that project were not fully developed or fully thought out, and therefore you have an opportunity again to present. So the question of empathy, I think, does exist, but equally it is up to the NGO to try and, again, we're talking with mutual collaboration. And this is where the NGO in question has got to say, okay, I'm going to be proactive. I'm going to respond to the funder. I'm going to try and set up a meeting to see him or her so that I can clarify some issues regarding our particular project. And I think that is how we develop relationships with funders anyway. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. The next question is what indicators can best capture the impact of learning integration beyond anecdotal success stories?
Yes, you can look at the progress of learners. For example, they read your diaries. You can have, when you have your training workshops, you break them up into small groups. And in that small group, within those small groups, you can observe the dynamics of what is called group dynamics. You can observe personality traits. You may have one particular person as a discussant. In other words, that person's leading the discussion. You might have others who are not involved in the discussion, but they're quietly listening. So you can do a lot of observational research and pick up information from time to time. You could also look at the notes that beneficiaries or participants make from time to time. You can ask them to come out and write on a sheet of paper what they think about the program. And you can also look at the evaluation that they do from time to time and corroborate or compare that with what they've said on a piece of paper. And the other thing, of course, is to listen to them as well too, because listening is very, very important, because when we listen, we can learn so much about people. So those are some of the indicators I would suggest you can use, both informal as well as formal. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, for your input. The
Welcome.
next question is, how can open dialogue funding models be scaled while maintaining fairness and transparency?
Yes, open dialogue has a lot to do with what I would call a series of continuation of discussions with funders. So, for example, in our case here in the United Kingdom, we have been having meetings with several funders, and this is based on projects that we intend to roll out in 2026 and beyond. And so what we've done, we've created slots for Zoom and Google Teams, whereby funders come on the platform, they pitch their particular priorities and programs for the next 5, 10 years. And then we look at the priorities and see how those priorities meet within our strategy. If they don't meet, we try to adapt. And then we have other meetings with them to consider applications, ideas around applications. So even though you may not give anything away, what you're trying to do is to try to get into their minds, what is it you're trying to do? My point here is that the relationship between you and a funder must be continuous. It's like a family extension relationship, in my view. You should see your funders as members of your family because, after all, they're helping you to generate revenue, and they're also providing you with resources that are technical as well as informational. So I would say those are some of the ways in which you can actually negotiate and collaborate with your funders.
The
Thank you.
next question is, how can funders and NGOs ensure data ethics are upheld when using AI-driven digital tools in low resource setting?
A very loaded question indeed.
Yes.
There are very few laws or statutes or regulations now governing ChatGPT, Gemini, and AI tools now, because it is almost a field there, as far as I can see. What I think is important is the kind of information we are looking for. That's one. And two, what data are we looking for as well? And once we can identify those two areas, we can then begin to inquire what type of digital tools we need to use to access information. Do we need to use Google, for example, search engine? Do we need to use Scientific Commons? Do we need to use ResearchGate to find the latest information? Do we need to look at medical frontiers to look at what's happening in other parts of the world where health issues are concerned? Or do we need to look at medical journals across the world to find out how we can impact on certain chronic diseases, etc.? So there are a variety of ways in which we can actually manage digital tools and have ethics involved. My own view is that you should also understand your Data Protection Act in your country or locality, because that will also tell you something about how you apply specific data tools. In terms of the use of AI tools, I've said repeatedly that AI is there to provide a structure. It is there to redevelop concepts, but it is not there to replace human initiative. In other words, it's not there to dislocate our ability to think and create. It is there to enhance and improve. And that is what we should be using AI tools for, because it can build capacity and it can strengthen the organization's image and reputation. But everything depends on the human initiative at the end of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, for your input. The next question is, How can NGOs balance honesty about challenges with the risk of funders perceiving them as weak or underperforming?
Again, you have to be open and respectful at the same time. So, for example, if you have a project and you do a risk analysis, you do risk factors, and then you do mitigation factors as well. Within that project, you would probably discuss some of the challenges. One of them could be that you have a limited number of administrators. You may have a limited number of technicians within the organization. You may have a limited number of volunteers. Now, those are challenges in themselves, but they don't necessarily convey, or they should not convey to funders that there's a weakness within the organization. All it shows is that there are some limitations within the organizations, and those limitations are strengths in themselves. Because once you recognize that there are issues around your administrators, issues around technicians and volunteers, then the opportunity arises whereby you can use your network, your local networks, to access those human resources. So telling or ventilating to a funder some of the challenges you have should not be perceived as a weakness or a set of weaknesses. In fact, funders like to know what challenges you have because that's why you're looking for the funding to solve a problem, to find solutions. And in accessing funding, you can add to your recruitment drive of administrators, volunteers, and technicians. So I think there's a fine balance between a challenge and an opportunity. And it is how you actually code that particular challenge and opportunity, how you present it, how you articulate it on a piece of paper will determine, how funders would respond to you. But by all means, be open, respectful, and honest. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, for your input. The next question is: what are effective ways to rebuild trust if a difficult conversation with a funder goes wrong?
Yes, again, I'll use the example of applications being rejected, and we've had a few of them, just a few of them over the last 25 years. So, for example, if an application is rejected, some members of the directorate or trustees they become dejected, they become non-compliant, they go into a state of nervousness because they're wondering what's going to happen now, what's going to happen if we don't get this funding. As the leading director and trustee, my duty and responsibility is to write to the funder, setting out some of our concerns, but also asking questions. Why is it that the funding was not given? What are the issues? Does it have to do with the concept idea? Sorry, the idea? Does it have to do with the way how the application was structured? Does it have to do with our accounting and financial procedures, quality control? So you ask all of these questions, but you could only ask those questions if you understand your project. So it is not up to the funder to determine whether your application is successful or not. It is also, you also have a mutually beneficial relationship with the funder. So it is up to you as the NGO to also say, okay, this is what we presented. What are the issues? Unless you decide to be proactive, unless you decide to take an intelligent position, you cannot question the funder's decision at the end of the day. So by all means, make sure that you understand your remit as an NGO, understand your project proposal and the priorities within which that proposal tends to fit in, and then understand what the funders are trying to suggest. And take all of those things into consideration. You can certainly resuscitate or reinvigorate that relationship between your NGO and the funders in question. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, for your input. Participants Due to time limitation, we cannot cover all the questions posted here. As now we have reached the end of the webinar, I want to thank each one of you for active participation. Participants, please take a moment to fill out the feedback form for today's session. Your input is crucial in helping us to improve. If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to contact us at support@fundsforNGOs.org. The feedback form will appear on your screen in a moment. Once again, thank you, Dr. Christopher.
You're welcome.
And to all the participants, we look forward to seeing you in our next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much and goodbye.
Bye.